We are now going to move from the architects to the sleepwalkers. We discussed a little bit this morning about some of the differences and similarities between the era of 1814, I say that again, 1814, and 2014. Unfortunately, at least from my perspective, we're looking in 2014 a lot more like 1914. Given what's going on not so far from here in Ukraine and Syria and much of the Middle East, we probably have more, I think, to learn today from the sleepwalker phase, the 1914, when the doomsday machine was let loose in World War I. So let me turn the panel over to John Lotherington to discuss World War I and the sleepwalkers.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to everybody. And I'd first of all like to welcome our panel for this afternoon's discussion of 1914. To my right is Prince Schwarzenberg, who has occupied different domains and indeed different countries with a multitude of experience, both working in the world of human rights and a leading figure in that, living in Austria and latterly in the Czech Republic, of which he has been foreign minister. So a huge amount of practical experience to bring to bear on our discussion today, and a very distinguished family history, of course, relating to some of the events that we will be discussing. And then next to him, we have Ned Lebow, who is a professor of international political theory at King's College London, has worked in the UK, the US, and other countries as well, and has a very intriguing take on some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. His most recent work being Archduke Franz Ferdinand Lives, a book in which he explores ways in which there may have been different futures that emerged out of 1914, a counterfactual work, reminding us of the importance of contingency, and also, of course, very much of a point that was made by Margaret Macmillan yesterday, of agency. There are choices. How are those choices made? That's going to be one of our themes today. And then, finally, we have Oliver Rathkolb, the distinguished contemporary historian of Austria at the University of Vienna. And Oliver has been moving, as it were, back in time to consider the origins of contemporary Austria, and also looking back into the 19th century at some of the forces towards globalization then, and the type of globalization that was being experienced in the generation before the First World War in comparison with the globalized world we have today. So a warm welcome to our panel. Now, there are many historians who have an allergy when somebody starts saying, history teaches us that, and then fill in some opinion, which is often poorly based. Indeed, one of the interesting things is going to be not just the reading of history, but the misreading of history. An English historian of a previous generation and somewhat mischievous disposition called A.J.P. Taylor was once reflecting on how the appeasers of the 1930s had viewed the saber rattling and the run-up to war in 1914. And looking at that, his comment was, the only thing that people learn from past mistakes is how to make new ones. And that, I think, is something worth bearing in mind. But we should not, of course, ignore the conversation with the past, which is so important. And one example, which I think is entirely pertinent to the topic we're about to discuss, is that back there in 1962, a book was published by Barbara Tuchman called The Guns of August. Robert McNamara read this book, was hugely impressed. He passed it on to John Kennedy, the president, who likewise was hugely impressed. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy kept referring back to that particular book and its account of the events of 1914. And his comment was, whatever else happens, I don't want a book to be written that's called, not The Guns of August this time, but The Missiles of October. And he said he wanted every Navy officer to read a copy of that book, though he didn't expect that they would actually read it. That was his view. Now, interestingly, Barbara Tuchman was a literary historian rather than a fully academic historian, and there are ways in which her book has been picked over and huge holes have emerged in it from a historical point of view. But boy, did that have an impact, that book, possibly saving the world or helping to save the world from a nuclear Armageddon. So the importance of looking at 1914, I think, is evident. Now, in the way we're going to look at it today, looking backwards to 1814 and forward to 2014, we're first going to hear 5 minutes from Oliver, then from Ned, and finally from Prince Schwarzenberg. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to the afternoon session, the most difficult one after lunch, but we will try hard to wake you up. I will pick up your argument, which I think George Bernard Shaw very well phrased in his Revolutionist's Handbook when he noted, quote, "We learn from history that we learn nothing from history," unquote. But I think it's very important, and the example which was just cited concerning the Cuban Missile Crisis is a very good one, that history can be extremely helpful and useful in a critical analysis of an ongoing decision, and maybe even important, even more important, could be an important tool in forecasting and preventing conflicts. This is a matter I will briefly touch on at the end. I will limit my first remarks to taking up the very important argument of Margaret Macmillan that when you are dealing with World War I, you have to contextualize it with the first globalization. You saw a large number of very well thought arguments in this film in the morning. I would like to add, however, an additional important topic which has not been yet covered. On the one hand, we talk about peace in Europe. Yeah? I would say it was relatively peace. If you read the battle histories of the Battle of Solferino, of Königgrätz Sadova, of the French-Prussian War, it's unbelievable cruel. These are cruel battles, mostly limited warfare, but nevertheless. But, and this is my argument, which we have to consider when talking about a global dimension of the Congress of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna was excluding the rest of the world. We'll have an unlimited amount of extreme violence in the 19th century outside Europe. If you go to China, take the Dungan Revolt, 8 to 10 million people have been killed. Take the brutal regime of Leopold II of Belgium between 1885 to 1908. Approximately 5 to 8 million people were killed. And if you try to analyze the problems in the Congo today in the 21st century, you have to go back to the 19th century. It means my first thesis would be that we already had an incredible, strong amount of violence outside Europe, which also, I think, has to be included in the interpretation of the First World War. Now, briefly to 3 to 4 arguments concerning the impact of the first globalization and maybe a comparison with the globalization which is affecting our society since the 1980s. One of the, I think, most interesting thinkers in Europe, George Lukács, once called this period between 1850, 1870 to 1914 in German transzendentale Obdachlosigkeit, transcendental homelessness. And I think he's really putting his finger in the key issue of identity conflicts as a result of migration, of the building of national states, of conflicts. It's also, I think, a battle, a struggle about identities in the context of the first globalization. And when we look to the second globalization, I think we have a very similar topic to discuss. One issue which I think is important when talking about globalization, both in the first globalization and second globalization, is the parameter of generation. Yeah? It's very important to analyze the effects of globalization, for example, on the young generation in the 19th century. We heard a positive example in the film, the L'Art Nouveau, art and scientists, science was booming before 1900, yeah? But the same people, like Sigmund Freud you have seen, were very much in favor of the war. He even experienced a new kind of libido for Austria-Hungary in this beginning. That means we have two sides of modernity. Yeah? We have a positive side. We are still, I think, very much profiting from the first modernity, but at the same time, it has a very, very dark side. We can go to Italy, we can go to France, we can go to Austria-Hungary. You have a majority of this modern elite which is in favor of the war, at least in the beginning. Therefore, I think, especially when we try to compare first and second globalization, we should also focus on the impact on generations, because generations, I think, in these massive changes of society are looking for values. Yeah? It can be the values of modernity, yeah, of rationality, science, arts, education, democracy, for example. But it can go also in the other side, going to war, trying to solve problems with the instrument of a brutal war at that time. Right now, when we look at the demographic changes in the world, also in Europe in particular, I think we have quite a similar issue. And when you analyze the personal profiles of terrorists, key terrorists in the world, I think generation matters, and we have, I think, a very important topic to address, which I can't elaborate. The second issue concerning first and second globalization, which strikes me as a historian, is the fact that especially young people have a tendency in time of crisis to look back into a constructed past, because it seems to be secure. Yeah? When you analyze, for example, the history of students at German and Austrian universities pre-1914, they are really constructing a specific form of German culture, already very aggressive against Jews, very racist already, and this is something, as you all well know, that National Socialism had just to pick up. It was already there. Therefore, I think it's important to discuss also with negotiations and changes of value system, especially for young people who are really, to a large extent, influenced by globalizations, both pre-1914 and also after 1985. And as a short PS, if you analyze the history of fascism, generation also very much matters with regard to the front generation and the lack of democratic elites in Italy, for example, or in Germany, or in Austria. This, and that's the final argument, this strange return of history is something which we are also experiencing today. Yesterday, I think we had a very good example about this completely misconstruction of the caliphate as a propaganda slogan, which has nothing to do with the real history of the caliphate. But it's working. It's working in PR. It's working. It's also, I think, something which is important in times of change to deliver a solid base where people can be also addressed. The last issue, I think, which already was addressed in the previous panel by Claire Shine, and is a very important one. I think right now in the 21st century, as a result of digital revolution, knowledge societies, we have an unbelievable amount of information and knowledge throughout the world. What's really lacking, I think, is to get this amount of information and knowledge to the attention of political decision makers and the media to deal more in a long-range analysis of future developments in crisis regions and thereby include political forecasting into the day-to-day political agenda and enabling effective conflict prevention, and not just reacting when the conflict has exploded. You have a very concrete example where, unfortunately, Austria and Germany and many European countries were involved. It was only due to NATO and the US that the massive conflict was solved. This is the wars in Yugoslavia. Everyone who knew Yugoslav society under Tito very well was aware of what was existing in this society. My sister-in-law is Slovene, and I was struck as a young student to be in a society in Slovenia and at the same time have such a high amount of hatred against Serbs and vice versa, but they are within one state. And I think this is a key problem. There's a large amount of knowledge around, also with regard to the Ukraine, but obviously there's no instrument, no institution to fuel this information to prevent conflicts and not react too late. Thank you.
Oliver, thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask a very quick follow-up question about comparative globalizations? And it might be under the heading of the dangers of optimism. The generation before 1914 had many mounting tensions, but there was that prevailing optimism which was expressed famously in a book by Norman Angell, who suggested that given economic interdependence, war would be madness. To be fair to him, he didn't say it was impossible. He just said it would be mad. But it was part of a general feeling that we won't do this. And of course, one of the huge ironies of the summer of 1914 was the degree of relaxation for a lot of time as the crisis mounted. We will sort this out. Similarly, would you say that in the recent generation's globalization, there has also been undue optimism that we were set on a course of progress and would just sort our problems out? And has there been perhaps a spell of salutary disillusion in recent times?
No, I would see it in the other way around. I think right now we have especially in Europe, the amount of pessimism is extremely high. In my opinion, much too high. If you compare it, for example, with the US, who's quite a different approach to these issues. But what's really striking regard to 1914, that the decision to go to war, and you're an expert on this and have published extensively on this, was completely irrational from the point of view, for example, of Austria-Hungary, with an extremely weak army. It was clear that they never could even win the war against Serbia. They knew it. You have the letters of the general staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, to his beloved fiancée, really writing about that. We go to war, but we can't win it. And it's a very strange situation. And my explanation is that obviously the changes were too fast. The changes in the first globalization, in my opinion, with regard to time, transportation, communication, were much further compared to our globalization, much more intensive. I think it was too much for society, and I think this is also an argument we could discuss. In my opinion, only democratic societies are able to cope with the effects, with the positive and negative effects of globalization. Austria-Hungary was a very authoritarian monarchy. Germany had quite some constitutional background, but still, if you go to the elites, is a very authoritarian state. And, globalization also means a much broader integration of people into the political and economic decision-making. And I think it's therefore logical that the winner of World War I is the country with the most open democratic structure, the United States. They were able to really cope with the globalization, take the benefits, and really bring it to another sphere.
Thank you very much. And now over to Ned for his remarks.
Well, that is indeed a very optimistic aspect. If you are convinced that the more democratic we are, the more we can cope with these problems. I wouldn't be quite convinced of it, but that we can discuss later. I do think, of course, the situation is very different. You rightly said that the generation between 1914 was full of optimism. We shouldn't forget that at this time, Europe was on top. It was Europe who was dominating the world by the huge colonial empires. It was a time where in the whole world people started to dress like Europeans, where the European way of life was accepted, the only and the modern one, and so on. So Europe was dominating, in difference today, where Europe admittedly is rather in full decay, and therefore there's little optimism here. This is one thing. And the other thing, you mentioned before, by right, the cruelties which happened in the 19th century. But that was far away. In spite of all possibilities of telegrams and so on. Still, the news, what happened in China or in Congo, arrived much later and largely diluted and were not really interesting for most Europeans. It was a Europe-centered world. That is one thing. And actually, all the leaders of Europe had not the slightest idea what this war will be like. The only ones who should have had an idea were the Russians after the experience of the Russian-Japanese War, but evidently it didn't, it was too far away that this lesson would have been accepted in Petersburg. So the people, whereas we have one great luck today, thanks to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, we have at least an idea what a new war, a great war would mean today. And we have, of course, already in these last decades, the experience that no place in the world would be safe. In World War I, as cruel it was, if you were 20 miles of the battle zone, you could have a peaceful life. Nothing happened to you, and it was the soldiers who were killed. The situation has completely changed. You have nobody's safe around in the world. If you are on the list, a drone can get you wherever. And in the last wars that we've watched today in Syria and Iraq and wherever, there are more civilians killed than soldiers. So the character of the war has completely changed. And of course, still in World War I, there's still some attitudes or habits from the past. I love one story because I knew the man. There was in Upper Austria near Kirchdorf an Austrian gentleman who had a little estate. And World War I first started, he of course went to the army. He was with the Welser Dragoner, and he took part in the last big cavalry battle of history, the Battle of Jaroslawice, where both three divisions fought. Well, when he woke, he was in Russian captivity of a Cossack regiment, was in the field hospital, but as he was young, he had a lance pushed his shoulder, and he got with a saber over his head, so he had, but he was young. After a week, he was quite all right, and he got an invitation to the Russian casino. And the Russians, as you know, have the habit, you can have no drink without a toast. So the first toast was, of course, to His Majesty the Tsar. But the second toast was already, and it was a Russian commander who gave the toast, was to the most venerable monarch of Europe, Emperor Francis Joseph I. And the third toast was, gentlemen, we also, a week ago, our guest of honor today, fighting valiantly against us. He was really very brave in front of his soldiers, and we are very glad he's recovering, and so on. And so it was a pleasant evening, having a lot of drinks till the night, as it was a Russian habit. That was 1915.
But it was not typical for World War I. It was not typical for World War I.
They were quite similar.
It's
But 25 years later,
story.
25 years later, the war was present, and Austria was occupied by the Germans, and so because he had his left arm not really moving, so he was an active officer, but could work on his little estate. But it was so small that he worked himself on the field with his people. And as all his help that in the 40s 30s, 40s, there was little machinery in Austrian agriculture. Most was done still by hands. So, but his hands went to war, so he got French prisoners of war and worked with them on the field successfully for the harvest. Okay, so it was usual then in Austria. At midday, the lady of the house came with a huge bowl of soup and a loaf or two of bread for everybody. Everybody sunk his bread into the soup, and that was a lunch for the world. A few days later, he got a letter from the Gestapo in Kirchdorf that he should know that by now he's a German officer in reserve, and there was a Führer Erlass, no fraternization with the enemy, and they were told that he has his lunch and eats from the same bowl with his French prisoners of war. Whereupon he answered that he worked the whole day with them, and if he worked with them the whole day, and they were very nice and good workers, so we will eat with him too. Well, for 2 years, he could think about his youth in a nearby place called Mauthausen. And that was the finish of the story. There you see the barbarization of Europe in 25 years. Was total change of attitude towards our. Still, I do think what we should see in World War I too, 1914, that what we can't conceive, quite understand, but I knew in my being rather old now, when I was a very young man, I knew still a lot of people who were fighting in the World War I, who were diplomats and so on. But of course the difference was, what we can't conceive, World War I broke up an order of 1,000 years. It needed 1,000 years, this border was completely broke up. Whereas, if you look at the cruelties today in the Near East, where finally the order which the victorious powers of World War I, United Kingdom and France imposed Near East, is breaking down. What is now in the year happening in the Near East is what happens beginning of 90s in Europe, or Central Europe. The borders which were created in Versailles broke down. Yugoslavia broke up, Czechoslovakia broke up. Everything has changed.
I think we're going to be coming back to the issue of borders later in our discussion, an absolutely vital theme. I'd like to bring in Ned now for his remarks before we broaden out the discussion.
Thank you very much. The microphone is on. Let me start by revisiting Barbara Tuchman. Indeed, everything you say is correct, and Kennedy and McNamara were deeply influenced by reading her thesis that World War I broke out because nobody understood the consequences of mobilization, that it was a war that nobody wanted. Now, clearly there's still lots of controversy about the nature of World War I, but almost nobody buys the argument today that it was runaway escalation and that political leaders had no knowledge of the mobilization plans and the consequences. I bring this up because it illustrates a more important point. That is that bad historical lessons can often have good policy consequences, and vice versa. If you think, for example, of the learning that took place about the threat of inflation in Germany in the 1920s, it was an appropriate lesson, but the way it's been applied has come to plague European recovery. And we can find many examples of both, but no logic that lets us parse beforehand which lesson is correct or which should be applied when. So we have to be very careful, not only about our claims about lessons, but the situations in which we think they're applicable. There are two traps that await us. In my remarks, I'm not going to build on the arguments of my book, Archduke Franz Ferdinand Lives: A World Without World War I, but I thank you for giving it a plug. Rather, I'm going to wear my hat as a psychologist and international relations scholar and report some of the results of my study over the decades of war prevention and crisis management, addressing not only World War I, but a series of other cases up to the present. And what I'd like to do is lay out 4 lessons and then make one general observation, and I'll do this briefly so there's time for questions. The first lesson of World War I, and indeed almost all crises, is that what really matters are the assumptions that leaders bring to the table. And yet these assumptions are hardly ever questioned. Rather, the debate concerns the tactics of implementing policies and goals. One of the reasons this happens is leaders are human beings. And when any of us feel deeply threatened and forced to make decisions that are momentous in their risks and possible costs, we immediately seek to spread the risks and surround ourselves with other people and with people with whom we feel comfortable. And those are people who share our assumptions. So around the table, the assumptions are not only never debated, they're rarely made explicit. And if your assumptions are incorrect, which they so often are, your policy is unlikely to succeed. That's point one. Point number 2, again, a general rule which has been documented in case after case, and again, I refer not only to Western crisis decision-making, but from non-Western countries as well, is leaders routinely exaggerate the constraints under which they operate and underestimate the constraints under which other leaders operate. In 1914, every country was convinced that the other had the opportunity to back down. But they felt, for combinations of domestic and strategic reasons, that they couldn't and that others would understand this, which of course they did not. And it was a fundamental cause of the crisis and of its escalation. You can find parallels to this in the Middle East, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It happens time and time again. Number 3, leaders consistently exaggerate the extent to which they can limit risks and control escalation. And let me turn for my example here to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy and McNamara, having read Barbara Tuchman, were particularly sensitive to this problem. The CIA estimated that there were 10 to 11,000 Soviet military personnel in Cuba, and concluded that these were all training forces designed to help the Cubans upgrade their military. In fact, the Soviets had 43,000 soldiers as a combat brigade. These troops were equipped with Luna missiles that had nuclear warheads. They had advanced orders requiring them to fire them against an American invasion fleet if it appeared on the horizon. They did not have to seek further authorization from Moscow. The American military was, of course, throughout the crisis, pushing Kennedy and McNamara not only to launch the airstrike against the missiles, but of necessity to follow it up with an invasion. Had Kennedy and McNamara gone down this road, which fortunately they didn't, you can readily imagine the scenario of these missiles being fired, the invasion fleet being destroyed or severely damaged, and the Americans responding God knows how, but with a major escalation of their own. And I can offer, I think with some confidence, the counterfactual conclusion that it's unlikely we would be having this meeting. So even in circumstances where leaders are very sensitive to these issues, they make serious mistakes. And in 1914, the Germans were convinced the Russians would stand aside. And they based that, of course, on the outcome of the 1908 Bosnian annexation crisis. And it was precisely because the Russians had backed down in 1908 that they decided they could not do so again. This story could be told in many details, but I think you get the point. The next and connected and in a way more fundamental issue has to do with the ways in which leaders assess the kinds of threats they make. What is so interesting in the 1914 case, which has reflections later in history as well, is that they were sensitive to the wrong threats, and they adopted policies to respond to those threats, which only made the problem worse. And the information was available at the time that this would happen. So just to take the case of Germany, the Germans were deeply worried about Russia, Russian development, Russian mobilization. The battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes made it perfectly clear that the Germans had absolutely nothing to worry about. And indeed, the deeper the Russians came in to Prussia, the easier it was for the Germans to defeat them. Moltke and Falkenhayn and the conservatives were deeply worried about the rise of social democracy, and with it, the spread of materialist capitalist values. They worried for the survival of their class and of the values associated with the Prussian aristocracy. They thought a war would keep socialism in its place, and of course it did the very reverse. One could tell the same story about Austria-Hungary and about Russia. Strategy is a harmonious relationship between ends and means. All the decision makers of the three Eastern monarchies, and indeed you could argue the French as well, chose the wrong goals and inappropriate strategies. And of course, in retrospect, this is far more obvious than it was at the time. But again, it should have been obvious and wasn't, and where it was obvious, it was denied. And I'll offer only one example here, the contrast between the elder and the younger Moltke. So Elga Moltke, who's responsible for the great victories of the German unification era, by 1912 had become convinced that a victory in war in Europe was impossible. And it was impossible for two reasons. There were millions and millions of men under arms. So no matter how decisive a first battle you won, it was not winning the war. So the Schlieffen Plan was fundamentally an effort to win a campaign, not a war. The elder Moltke and Schlieffen himself, even more Schlieffen, became convinced that the only possible response to this was peace. And the older he became, the more anti-war he became. The second reason was he recognized that even though they had defeated France in 1870, the French nation did not want to surrender. It led to the Paris Commune, a revolution. This would happen again. Countries would lose control. Things would get worse, not better, as a result of victory, not only as a result of defeat. Moltke, the junior, recognized this too, and he further recognized that a defensive campaign would work. He tried to rig the war games repeatedly to prove that a defensive against France would fail. He couldn't do it. The Germans won every war game. But the defense was unmanly, and Moltke, in any case, hated the French and wanted to go to war with them. So the element of irrationality enters into it and is triggered, in this case, by rational analysis of what the problem is. My final point concerns architects and sleepwalkers. And I was afraid after eating this very nice lunch that I would be a sleep talker, but I've managed to avoid that. The term sleepwalker has, of course, been given great currency by the wonderful book by my Cambridge colleague, Chris Clark, and I think it is a superb book. I disagree with its central thesis of sleepwalking. These people were architects, not sleepwalkers. They knew what they were doing, and in the immediate aftermath of World War I, they all wrote very self-serving memoirs in which they claimed, well, to quote, since we're on the Austrian theme today, Konrad von Hitzendorf, that World War I was like a thunderstorm that broke overhead. You know, the Gewitterwolke were there. There was nothing that could be done. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Huh? The notion that Europe was dry kindling waiting for a spark is largely a myth, and many historians followed suit, reading the memoirs and propagated this most successful myth. And I admire Clark because he and Margaret Macmillan too and Hugh Strawn are trying to move away from the argument of who was responsible for war to how war came about. But I think Clark overdoes it by using this sleepwalkers analogy. And if we stay with it, we'll learn the wrong rather than the right lessons. And there's much in his book that teaches us the right lessons, beginning with his treatment of the Balkans. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nick. Can I just ask a quick supplementary about leadership and then broaden out the discussion with the whole panel? And that's Heifetz and Linsky's famous formulation that leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. Now, if you look back in 19...
Yes, well, Obama's learned a lot about that.
Yeah, well, we will come back to that. 1914, you can see how this operated. You were averted to it when you were talking about Bosnia in 1908. The Tsar was in a position where it would be very, very difficult to back down again because of the war against Japan, because of Bosnia. You have a Kaiser who felt humiliated in the Morocco affair. You had the Austrians who felt regularly humiliated by the Serbs. There was this issue of feeling pressure, and we will then perhaps come back to questions about the relationship between democracies and also populism, a pressure from below to take action. Would you agree that was there and significant in 1914? And how would you compare today's world in the same terms of leadership?
I agree it was there, but I don't think it was the decisive factor. It was a contributing factor. What I think was more important was the frame of reference that leaders put on the issue. Now, international relations theory says that leaders are motivated by questions of security or material well-being. Neither of those were front and center for anybody except perhaps the British in 1914. This was framed as a matter of honor. And we have to be very clear that when you seek either to gain or maintain honor, you accept risk. In fact, it's even dishonorable to carry out a rational cost calculus of risk and gain. That's an oxymoron when you're driven by honor. Franz Ferdinand, this was what, the third assassination of a member of his family? And he was very clear. He said, we're likely to go down in defeat, but we'll go down with honor. The Kaiser, who was a man of bluster, but also quite cowardly, framed his role, and you read this in the marginalia on the memos. Austria had challenged Serbia to a duel, and his role was to act as second to the emperor. Again, framed in terms of honor. And the same thing with the Russians. And when honor becomes so central, as Max Weber observed, States will make all kinds of compromises with respect to security and material well-being, but not with respect to honor. And I've tried to explore this in my cultural theory of international relations and argue that this is the missing piece of the political puzzle. And there's a reason for it, right? Honor was traditionally associated with the aristocracy. And one way of undercutting their claim to power was emphasizing the value of appetite and rethinking it as something valuable, and honor as something evil, a project that actually begins with Sancho Panza and our great Don Quixote. Even though the discourse has expunged honor from our vocabulary, it's still, as the ancient Greeks understood, a powerful human motive. And to understand American foreign policy today, you have to start from the premise that being what Americans claim to be a hegemon, which they're not, has become central to the American identity, the self-esteem of American leaders and people. And they view China as a threat to that, quite independently of anything else. And much of nationalism is based on honor and self-esteem. And unless we understand this conceptually, and here World War I is very helpful, we're not going to address what are fundamental causes of so many international conflicts.
So we're here to think about the similarities and differences between 1914 and 2014, and that's a very interesting point, that we shouldn't be bamboozled by the disappearance of a very specific honor code from 1914, because there are structural variants that are still at work today. A word that was used by statesmen and historians very greatly, an allied concept, was prestige. Prestige matters. It still does. It's not a word that's used so much in discourse, and perhaps has to be thought about. Come back to you in a moment, Ned, but...
Yes, of course, the society has changed totally. I mean, 1914, a gentleman who was offended, of course, had to answer by asking the other for a duel, which was natural. And even an officer who didn't do that was expelled for the army. I mean, that's another way of thinking. But because you were speaking about globalization, one shouldn't forget one simple thing, is that of all the peoples of 1914, only, as Karel has said, the Fortinbras, who was killed at the beginning of the tragedy, it was Archduke Franz Ferdinand who cared to travel through the United States, visit them. Nobody of all the people had an idea what the United States was, which is very typical. And I do think that we underestimate, I'm not quite sure with you, the pressure from below, because there were two elements in it. One, nationalism in each of these countries, and we have the hatred. There was, if we speak about anti-Semitism between World War I, it was not only in Austria-Hungary and Germany, but as we know, the affair Dreyfus was only a short time before. At contrary, Austria-Hungary was a few armies where a Jew could have a career in the army. And one of the best freed masters was Aufenberg, typically.
My wife's grandfather was a colonel in the KUK.
What?
My wife's grandfather was a colonel in the KUK,
Yes.
and he was Jewish.
Of course, yes. Now, that was a very different thing to some other countries. It would have been very possible still in the English army, and so on and so on. So we have to differentiate, but the hatred was actually there, and this romanticism were of an idolatry of the own nation. What I do think is that, of course, till the beginning of the century, very much it was a closed society of the people who were doing politics. And of course, there the sleepwalkers were correct. That what happened in Serbia, this what we would now call the terrorists who captured the state, was a completely new phenomenon. Now we have got a bit accustomed to it, still we are surprised of this effective political, effectivity to politics in that way. But for the people, most of the gentlemen, ladies were practically not present in politics then, who were active 1914, were born 50s, 60s and so on. And this outbreak of a totally other way of thinking, which was in the Balkan states, surprised them all. They didn't really know how to handle it. And of course, we should succumb, we should accept it as our partners. As the point of honor, you can't accept it. I mean, if we think of political decisions 100 years ago or at the time, we always to see it in context of their time. We always try to judge them because we have our knowledge. They didn't.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Oliver in just a second, but I'm then going to open to the floor. And please keep in mind some of the comparisons we might need to make, as I hope in as least as greatly a nuanced way as possible between 1914 and 2014. We talked about pressure from below. What exists in that way today? Someone mentioned yesterday President Putin has unleashed a nationalist tiger, which he now needs to ride. That was a statement in yesterday's discussion. We also have questions about, do we really understand how warfare works? Was it the case that in the United States, with the revolution in military affairs at the end of the 90s, that led into a mistaken set of assumptions about how war would work and the painful learning of lessons in Afghanistan and Iraq? So these are some of the questions that may cross-fertilize. So just let Oliver come in with a comment then, and then we'll open to the floor. Thank you.
Very briefly, I would like to take an argument you had made, and I fully agree with you that they were architects, they were not sleepwalkers, and we really, and there is a lot of material existing, go back into the political pressures in German and Austrian and Hungarian societies. Yeah? You have on the cover a very authoritarian state, very aggressive, very elitist, a declining empire in the case of Austria-Hungary. Just look at the industrial and economic parameters. A booming empire in the case of Germany, which however is not accepted as a colonial superpower at that time. And you know, as you have said, there are more components than just taking revenge against Serbia. For example, as you know, Franz Ferdinand was hated in Vienna. Yeah? The emperor disliked him. When he was killed, people said that we have the fortune that there will be no Asian despot. He had a very bad reputation in Vienna, which partly has to do with a different form of policy, taking also Bohemia and Moravia into the decision making. It was very, in German it's Befreiungsschlag. It's a final blow to solve all the problems of the monarchy at the same time. Yeah? It's a crazy idea. And that's the final point. I think in some circumstances we should discuss whether the second globalization also leads to maybe smaller final clause to solve completely other issues. Yeah? And I think the whole Serbian issue, terrorism, and you know, the aristocracy at the time has already, as you have said, well experienced anarchism at the time. Yeah? It was nothing a new phenomenon. Yeah? Therefore, they used it really to carry out this very final blow, which ended in a catastrophe.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got a forest of hands, lots of interventions. So I'm going to, as it were, move around the room and taking groups of three. Could everybody please keep their comments as brief as possible and as pointed a question as possible? Start off with James. Microphone? Oh, you have it.
Architects, sleepwalkers, it seemed there was a consensus that they knew exactly what they were doing, and I just want to ask about the Belgian border. And the argument, as I understood it back in the 60s, was that the politicians didn't understand the consequences of some of the military mobilization plans and the effect of those mobilization plans. And so my question is, to what extent do you believe the German leadership knew that going through Belgium would bring Britain into the war, or did they fall into your trap of overestimating their problems and underestimating the British problems?
Thank you.
What was it?
Mark Champion from Bloomberg View. You spoke about honor and the role that played in making dysfunctional the sort of rational decisions that you would expect statesmen to make. And I just wanted to throw out there and ask, we have an example at the moment with Putin, who is active, and there's a lot of discussion about why he does what he does. Some discussion about, Russia being humiliated. We had that word used yesterday, I think. Do you see some new version of honor being sort of played into calculations there?
Thank you.
Well, it has been enormously enlightening. I just would like to make one very brief comment, which is a question at the same time. Just before that, one small remark. Franz Ferdinand was very much disliked not only in Austria, but especially in Hungary. So he was considered to be as an enemy of Hungarians. In fact, it was, the only person in the Austro-Hungarian leadership who opposed to the war was István Tisza, the Hungarian prime minister. At that time, he in fact sent 2 memoranda to the Kaiser, trying to convince him not to start the war. But that's, of course, a different story. Now, what I appreciated very much was the frequent reference this afternoon to the element of irrationality. And that recalls me a reading 35 years ago, which was written by at that time young French sociologist, Le Fou et le Prolétaire, I think was the title. And his main cause for World War I was an attempt of collective suicide. And interestingly, he refers to data collected by Durkheim in all European countries prior to 1914. And his conclusion is that at the end of the day, this was a collective suicide effort, which was, after all, partially, as we all know, successful. But now we also mentioned honor, prestige, and many other things. And my question is, of course, how can we tackle this factor of irrationality in the present situation, which is also there, no doubt.
Okay, thank you very much. Some responses from the panel, and we're looking at understanding. Did the Germans really know what they were doing as they crossed the Belgian border? Honor, with regard, for instance, to President Putin, and irrationality. And Ned would like to.
If I may, I give short is my mic on? I give short responses to all three. For Germany, mobilization was different than the other powers, because within 3 hours, German troops moved into Belgium. Everybody else, it was days between the mobilization order given and troops moving forward. The political authorities knew this. This was, Barbara Tuchman is wrong here. It was known by Bethmann Hollweg. Now, as for the consequences of going into Belgium, the evidence is now overwhelming that the British had made clear that this was something they were unlikely to be able to accept, that many Germans knew this. Lichnowsky, the ambassador in London, certainly made this clear to the Germans. There was a misleading cable at the height of the crisis that led the Kaiser to call for champagne, that the British would stay out and even think about sending the army east. But this again shows the extent of the delusional thinking on the side of the Germans. And most historians now accept this rather than the argument that the British failed to practice deterrence successfully. As for the question...
So the German leadership didn't know that the British would respond
No, the German leadership was almost certain that the British would respond, but they were led by Moltke into believing that it wouldn't matter, that the war would be over before Britain could have any effect. And remember, the British had a very small expeditionary force, and the German political leaders never gave any thought to the consequences of an economic blockade in a long war. So they asked the wrong questions, even though they found some of the right answers. The honor question, it's clear that it's not only Putin, it's all major powers who are motivated by honor. If you want to explain the American intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, you can't do it on strategic or economic grounds. George Bush Sr. sent every one of his former senior officials and Henry Kissinger to plead with his son not to invade Iraq, that it was not only not in American interest, it was against American strategic interest and against American economic interest. You have to look elsewhere, and you have to look for questions of honor and primacy and standing and prestige to understand why the US acted. The Putin example of Russia is perhaps even more graphically so. So in this sense, it remains alive and well, and international relations theorists make a mistake in thinking that prestige is only a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And finally, it's always easy to have facile explanations like collective suicide. They're thoroughly unconvincing, and of course they're based on ex post facto knowledge of what actually happened, which none of the leaders had at the time.
Thank you. I think Oliver next, and then Sue.
Very briefly to the Belgium case, I think what's also important is that the invasion of Belgium completely destroyed the reputation of the German Empire in the US. If you look to the media, they are now the warrior, really the warriors. And I think this is the beginning of the US joining Britain and France against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This is an extreme consequence of the invasion. With regard to honor, I think I completely agree with you. I think it's obviously part of statesmanship on a specific political level. It's not only reduced to large states, but you find it also within leaders of small countries, small states. And with regard to Russia, it's interesting to see when you read, for example, Putin's speeches over the years, he's really trying to bring back the power status of the former Russian, not only Soviet Union, but also Russian Empire. And for example, he's dealing with World War II when there is the festivity in May in Moscow. It's a very important symbolic issue. And I must say, I think it would be an easy game also to acknowledge this. If you take the losses of the Russian people during World War II, it's unbelievable, including, by the way, forced and slave laborers and prisoners of war, to take up your example of the French prisoners of war. And I think this symbolic issue is an important one, and sometimes I have the feeling that neither the EU nor the US understands this very importance of symbolic issues like honor and prestige, even referring to the past. With regard to the third issue, you are partly right. If you analyze, for example, the suicide statistics in Europe as a result also of the first globalization, they are going up really to the extreme. It's an issue at a time, and when you go to the individual soldiers, they are, for example, really storming the army. It's very difficult, for example, in Austria-Hungary and in Germany to really organize these masses of people who are prepared to die, even on the elite level. For example, Arnold Schoenberg, very famous composer, he was really disappointed that he was not accepted by the army. And Fritz Kreisler was a famous violinist, was in Switzerland, in a neutral country. He went to Leoben, to Styria, to his regiment, gave a concert, and a few weeks later, by the way, was nearly killed by Cossacks at the Russian front. in this sense, you are partly right. I think we are in a historical age as a result of the first globalization. Yeah? People were really in a different sphere.
Thank you.
Well, I think there's several things we have to think about. Belgium. Germany is fixed for many years already on the Schlieffen Plan. And you couldn't realize the Schlieffen Plan without immediately attacking Belgium. Therefore, as the Germans prepared it for such a long time, they could enter Belgium in 3 hours' time, as was right mentioned. Because this Schlieffen Plan was, the icon of German general staff. And it was a typical technical thinking. They were thinking that they, according to the Schlieffen Plan, that they would in so many days be in Paris. And then if this is finished, then they could have an arrangement with the Brits. They probably knew that the Brits, which had always their dogma, that on the other coast there should be a great power, therefore they created Belgium. This was the idea of the whole creation of Belgium. But of course they said they will finish it in a short time, and then this problem will be finished. But of course, as you know, the miracle and the man, it stopped the German offensive, and therefore the whole plan, Schlieffen Plan, didn't work as it was originally intended. We are thinking here of honor and so, but mentioning even in 21st century, we should not omit two things. One, most people, including, of course, myself at least, we think in the terms and the ideas of the time we were young, which is a natural human thing. And so, if we speak about Putin, we shouldn't forget he was a man who grew up in a time and was already at that age, when the Russian Empire went from Erfurt to Vladivostok, and whole Central Asia belonged to the Russians. To lose it and to be in Russia partly back at the frontiers which existed before Peter the Great is of course inconceivable. It was worse than for the German generals, who therefore had some sympathies for Hitler at the beginning, because the loss of they called Western Prussia and Alsace-Lorraine. It was really enormous part of Russia which suddenly disappeared. So of course he has the ideas, as some Germans in the 30s, we have to get back the empire. It's a natural thing. We take slowly, we can leave it. How long did the French, did they accept fully the idea that the colonial empire in Africa doesn't exist? And let's not forget one thing, personal vainness, which plays in politics a greater role than we think. This is, you always underestimate the vainness of people.
That's a very interesting point. We'll move on. Can I just make reference as well to something Ned said about the onset of the Iraq War? I think this is perhaps an interesting case where you have history read through the prism of honor, as it were. The neocon lobby in the backup to that were focusing on the history of MacArthur in Japan in 1945. There was a lot of discussion about that, and that was offering a paradigm for the action that they saw coming. And of course, there was the occlusion of Vietnam and the problems there, very much by a generation who had been involved. So honor and the reading of history, obviously, very closely aligned. So some questions from the central box. 3 questions and then some responses. Please keep it as short and pointed as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I will have a question and 2 comments. I think the invasion of Belgium was a fig leaf. And I also very much prone to reject that there was democracy in the liberal imperialist cabinet. It was only Gray and a few others who were driving the policy. Nobody knew about the naval agreement with the French, which Cambon very aptly used against as a moral pressure on the British, that since, because of the naval agreement, I don't go into the details, people here know about that, Britain has an obligation, a moral obligation, to enter the war.
Could I ask you to come to the question quite
Yes,
quickly?
the question is, Russia constructed the Balkan League firstly and foremost as an anti-Austrian obstruct. They wanted, it was anti-Austrian in conception, the Balkan League in 1912. But after the invasion of Libya, it suddenly turned into an anti-Ottoman construct. So the relevance with 2014 is that we see Russians using the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine in the so-called New Russia. So, but will Russia be able to really control those Russian speakers, or will the Balkan League in a devious fashion return back? And since they already shot the Malaysian airline, okay, finishing.
Thank you very much.
Will
And
Russia
now-
will be able to control the
Indeed.
Russian speakers?
At the back row, please.
We focused quite a lot on the psychology of leaders in moving towards war in 1914 and even later in your presentation, some of the other wars. And we looked at the push coming or the pull coming from the masses. But in between these two, what we see at least today, and I'm not familiar with 1940, is the various vested interest groups competing with each other. And you don't really have leaders always taking decisions on their own. Even in countries like China and Islamic Republic of Iran, which appear very monolithic from outside, have tremendous competition of various interest groups, which determine whether the leader will be aggressive or less aggressive on a particular issue. But I don't know about Russia. So is Russia even more monolithic than China and Iran, and which is why the leader there can take a decision? Or we don't know enough about Russia from outside? And what was the situation in 1914 with regards to these competing interest groups?
Thank you. And then just along the back row. And could you say who you are? I'm sorry, I should have been asking you to do that. No, that's fine. Just carry on. But
Okay.
Could you say who you are?
Hi, I'm Stababat Manuri. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford, and I focus on the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army. I would like to find out about sort of seizing on what Professor Lebow was talking about in terms of the assumptions. In fact, I think it was Oliver who was speaking about the assumptions that leaders have, and sort of in situations when people feel threatened and leaders feel threatened, surrounding themselves with people who share those same assumptions, and of course the ways in which that reproduces the circumstances that lead to war. I'd like to find out what you think in 2014 we can do to surround ourselves with people with fundamentally different assumptions that allow us to be more self-reflective and perhaps even challenge the ways we conceive of global leadership. I think the leadership of 1814, 1914, and 2014 are just widely different in terms of even Europe's own relationships to the rest of the world in 1914, its relationships with its empires and so forth. Today you have a system of equals and states and so forth. So I'd like to just sort of hear you speak about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps a response first from Oliver.
I will limit my contribution to the last argument. I think it's a very important one. On the one hand, I would say that, especially in day-to-day politics, in cabinets, you have a strong tendency to have people around you who share the same opinion. But I think as a result of the digital revolution, politicians nowadays are confronted much more than in the past with opposite groups, opposite opinions. In this sense, I think this is a very important issue, also including NGOs, which play, in my opinion, a much more important role now in the 21st century than in the 1980s or even 1990s. With regard to 1914, you have the classical political different groups here. As was already said, the Hungarians were rightly dragging their feet for some time to join the effort in a war against Serbia. But in general, I think it's an internal conflict. And the change to the present is that right now, I think public opinion, especially if it's powerful, if it's really also using all methods of the digital age, can influence opinion. And in my opinion, even in Russia, and you see it also in China. Yeah? When you go, for example, to Macau, yeah, to take just a tiny little example, yeah, there is a young generation which really is fighting very hard to get open access to the internet. Yeah? That means I think we are approaching into a different sphere of information. But when it really comes to the decision making, it's difficult really to forecast. I think that then again there could be something what we call in German Bunkerstimmung, a bunker sentiment closed. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm more pessimistic. So both Alexander George and Irving Janis proposed as a possible remedy to close decision making the idea of having a devil's advocate. Somebody who would be invited into the decision-making group, who was highly respected, who would make the case for the other side or an other side. LBJ did this. George Ball was assigned to be the devil's advocate prior to the massive intervention in Vietnam. And there was a weekend where he was given a Saturday to make his presentation. He was then attacked by Bundy and McNamara, and LBJ felt more confident rather than less in moving ahead with his decision because he had listened to the other side. As for publicity and the internet, let me again stay with the missile crisis rather than 1914 at the moment. If you listen to the tapes, and as you probably all know, Kennedy had the XCOM sessions secretly recorded. On that very first day, the day when Kennedy found out that missiles had been discovered in Cuba, this most articulate man is unable to complete a simple declarative sentence. He interrupts himself. There are lots of ums and ahs. He stops in mid-sentence to start another sentence. A week later, at the height of the crisis, the tension is mounting, and Kennedy is cracking jokes and making fun of the chief of staff who wants to launch an attack. And everybody I interviewed who was around Kennedy agreed, whether they were hawks or doves, that if Kennedy had had to make the decision the first day of the crisis, there would have been an airstrike and an invasion, and of course we now know a nuclear war. The reason why Kennedy had a week of quiet deliberation was that he was able to telephone the several newsmen, starting with Scotty Reston of the New York Times, who had smelled what was happening, and say, look, it's really in the national interest that you keep this quiet. And Reston said, yes, Mr. President. There's no way that would happen today. Given modern media and the competition for getting information out, it's very hard to do anything in a deliberative way. And so leaders don't have the luxury of doing this in a crisis, and they're subject, as a result, to much more pressure, in addition to the psychological pressure. And the combination of political and psychological pressure is often disastrous.
Thank you. It's you, Schwarzenberg.
Well, there was a question, if there were interest groups. Yes, of course there were in this time. They were partly different from our time. Partly they were, of course, economic interests. But we shouldn't underestimate in that time, for instance, the Serbian Balkan interest group in Petersburg, which was mainly carried by the two beautiful daughters of the prince and later king of Montenegro, Crna Gora. But one of them married the most influential Archduke, Grand Duke, besides the Tsar Nikolai Nikolaevich. He married one of the Montenegrin daughters, Grand Duke Mikhail the other. And they were, of course, a very efficient lobby for the Serbian cause in Petersburg. But then the Montenegrins still thought themselves to be Serbians, they were the greatest Serbian patriots. I mean, that is a difference today. And similarly, we shouldn't underestimate some ideas which we have forgot about it. One of that the Tsar and Moscow as the third Rome, of course, should liberate Constantinople, the second Rome, as it was the idea that, of course, the Orthodox power, which was Moscow, should liberate Constantinople, give it back to Christianity, and of course Orthodox Christianity. And not to forget, which was, there was this pan-Slavic thinking in many countries too, which had a certain influence. And all these had, of course, their lobbyists in the different journalists, the different politicians, diplomats, and so on. So there were, of course, interest groups and lobbyist groups, which were different from today. But of course, if you look into the papers, letters, what the people say, you see their influence there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think what this discussion has established is that we can't avoid readings of the past, and it's so interesting to look at the way that those can be misreadings, as we were discussing, that can either have benevolent or, of course, malevolent outcome. We've been thinking about such concerns as honor and prestige, about, if you like, the anthropology of leaders as they gather together and affect each other, and the assumptions that they carry with them. All of those belong in particular tropes in 1914, but all of them are there in structural transformations in 2014. And I think a number of the points that we've just explored are going to be picked up in our next discussion, which will be at 3:30 back here on 2014, the flashpoints of today. Many thanks to our panel and all contributors.